Welcome to the Shifted podcast and video series. Each week we connect with teachers to hear their stories about teaching and learning during a global pandemic. We focus on shifting practices, digital tools and resources, health and wellness, maintaining balance, and supporting our students during these challenging times. The Shifted podcast is from the Greater Victoria School District in beautiful British Columbia, Canada, and is recorded on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. Hi everyone, welcome back for another special bonus episode of the Shifted podcast and video series. In the spring of 2021, in the Greater Victoria School District, we hosted a secondary assessment series that saw groups of teachers from all of our secondary schools engage in a multi-week deep dive into competency-based assessment practices. Over this time, teachers worked within cohorts in their school buildings and connected teachers across multiple subject areas as they explored their assessment practice from their own personal lens, connected to their own personal curriculum. Now, in the last installment of this series, which occurred on June 9th, we had assessment expert Tom Schimmer join us to answer questions, share some feedback and insights, and provide some fantastic anecdotes and sound bites into the hows, the whys, and the what we need to do to move forward with our assessment transformation. It was a great hour-long discussion, and I'm going to share that with you today as a special bonus episode of Shifted, because it's something that probably a lot of folks would really benefit from hearing. Tom is so articulate and is such an expert in this area. He can encapsulate things so much better than I ever could. So I'm pleased to share with you this special extended bonus episode of the Shifted podcast featuring Tom Schimmer. I hope you enjoy. Flesh this afternoon, Tom Schimmer. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Tom. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you today.
Yeah, no, I can't quite get over the hype of that gold star shining there on the slide. I appreciate it, but I see John's a little over the top, but it's all good. Yeah, no, it's great to join you today, and certainly would look forward to engaging in conversations about your learning and some of the things that you've done so far, and the way that you've grown in your own practices. It's always something that we have to grow into. Whenever there's change, we often resist change, especially if we're not the ones who initiated it. And of course, when you get a new curriculum, it's not new anymore really, but it's still new. Curriculum changes don't happen every year. It still takes some getting used to, and the nuances and all of the idiosyncrasies about that are important to kind of work yourself through. So I just want to congratulate you first to say that, this has been a year. It's almost cliche to say that this has been a year unlike any that we've experienced and or that you all have experienced, because I haven't worked in a school setting in a school district for over a decade. So I'm empathetic to how difficult this year has been. And I'm just impressed with the idea that you forged ahead with professional learning, and that you just, decided that regardless of what's ahead of us, that you're going to dig into the work. So I love that. So I applaud you for that. It's not been an easy year. It's not been an easy, 17 months or so. It's not been easy for anyone, but I just, I've never been more proud to be associated with teachers, and as an educator, it's been great to watch unfold. And I think we collectively, the royal we, have stepped up in a way that I think has been most impressive. So thank you for that. As far as your learning and getting used to the idea of focusing on competencies, I mean, there are lots of different nuances and lots of things to think about. But I think some of the most important things to just continue to get used to is the idea that the content is not the end, that the content itself is a means to an end now. And that, that was one of my big revelations, 13 years ago when I moved into the district office, when I worked in School District 67, thinking about how this shift to competencies was going to change the landscape. And one of the things that's frustrated me over the last, at least the last 5 to 7 years with the more modern iteration of the new curriculum is this messaging about how content doesn't matter and that content's not important. That to me is such a falsehood and such a disservice to really understanding what the move to the new curriculum is all about. Because as I've said to folks for years, that you can't think critically in a vacuum. You can't collaborate in a vacuum. You can't create in a vacuum. You have to think about something, and that's the content. But content competence is not the end. Content competence is the beginning. So I have to have some basic foundational knowledge in order for me to think deeply about a concept, for me to think critically about a dilemma, or for me to embark on an investigation, or sort of plan a problem solving in a collaborative format. We have to know something about what we're investigating or what we're trying to explore. So for me, content has just switched places. Content is now the substance, and the competencies are now the end. Each side of the ledger, if you will, and I think I talked about this in some of the clips from the ministry series that I did. Each side of the framework is incomplete. The competencies for me are what teachers really should put their focus on, but they are incomplete because they have no substance to them. They talk about analyzing or problem solving, or they talk about evaluating or using mental math strategies or what have you, but there's no specificity in any of the competencies about what you're supposed to think about. That's why you need the content on the right-hand side of the document. At the same time, it's really important to remember that you would only be able to go off of past practice if you isolated your focus on the content, because what the content is missing, it's missing the cognitive complexity. The content is a list of topics. There is no cognitive complexity identified. It just makes statements about topics that you're going to use. So the issue with that from an assessment perspective is the way you choose appropriate assessment methods is through identifying the cognitive rigor of the learning goals. And without cognitive rigor, you can't know how to assess that content properly. You will either under or over assess it if you're not sure. The only thing you might do is say something like, well, we did, Pythagoras last, in the previous curriculum, I used to do Pythagoras. I'm doing Pythagoras now, so I'll just use my old assessments. That's the only thing you could go by. So the competencies are incomplete. They lack the substance. The content is incomplete because it lacks the cognitive complexity. That's why the two have to go hand in hand. That's unavoidable. And that's what frustrated me on your behalf as secondary teachers when people would say content doesn't matter. I just think that's an absurd assertion. Content is not maybe the priority, but we're not dismissing. It can't all be about competencies without content, because content is what you think about. Anyone who has the ability to create or to think critically or to investigate or collaborate about anything has a deep understanding of it. I often use the example of automobiles. The people who are most innovative when it comes to automobile have mastery over how automobiles work. So the idea that they would do that in absence of content, anyway, rant over. The other advantage of focusing on the competencies, and John, I don't know how long you want me to, trust me, I've got incredible speaking stamina. So
you're on a good roll here, Tom. Keep it going.
I'm on a bit of a roll. And once that happens, you might as well let me, finish her up. But I've got one more really important point that I think is critical. So there's kind of a series of events that occur here, right? So I focus on the competencies. That means my criteria needs to be focused on the competencies, not the content. Now, there's a really important reason why that matters, and that continues to emerge in a lot of the academic literature. So in other words, you really should be able to build your criteria from the curricular competencies without knowing what content you're teaching. That for me would be a key step. Is here's my unit. What are the curricular competencies I'm focused on? What's the criteria? Now, what content am I going to use? If your units are still titled or organized around content, that for you is probably the next step in your journey, is to still organize your units, maybe by instructional topics, but take the step to identify the curricular competencies. Here's why that's important. I think I mentioned in the video clips as well, and it's hard to remember everything that was in every sort of video. Now with Zoom, it's sometimes I don't remember one week to the next. But I'm a big fan of task neutral rubrics. Learning rich, in our case, I would call them competency rich, but task neutral or content neutral rubrics. Now, I know it sounds really kind of superficial and flippant to say, hey, everyone, you really need to focus on learning. You look at me like, hey, thanks, Tom. I hadn't thought of that in my 25 years as a teacher. But there's a method to that and a reason for that. One of the things that's emerging right now, there is in the academic literature, and has been for a little while, is around feedback. And it's really sort of bringing to the surface why feedback isn't always effective in advancing learning. Now, there's a kind of the way feedback is talked about, especially on social media. It's often talked about as though there's a level of automaticity behind it, right? So give the students feedback and they'll automatically be this learning explosion. And that's not always true. That doesn't always, like, the existence of feedback is not what's needed. It's the quality of the feedback, et cetera. But here's my point. Sometimes feedback is ineffective. And one of the reasons it's ineffective is because it's too task focused. And that means why that's problematic is that the feedback you provide to a student in the immediate moment is not transferable. So if you changed the task, but we're assessing the same competencies, my question to you would be, could you use the same criteria? Could you use the same rubric? And I would want the answer to that to be yes. So in the academic literature, the effectiveness of feedback, here's the dichotomy that occurs. You can give students feedback on how to improve the quality of their task or their assignment in that acute moment. And they can do that, but it may not impact their long-term learning. And the opposite is also true. You can provide them feedback that doesn't really help them with the task in the immediacy, but it actually over time, helps them with their long-term learning. So I know it sounds flippant to say focus on the learning. And in the case of our curriculum here in BC, that would be the curricular competencies. Because every time you come back around to problem solving, every time you come back around to evaluating, every time you come back around to analyzing, data or things like that, if you're using the same criteria, that's going to first allow that criteria to start to be embedded into students, because they're not wondering, what rubric are we using today, Mr. Schimmer? Like it starts to become a death by rubric spiral. And I think that's less than favorable. Now, I want to be clear. You can do both. There's no research that says you can't have task-specific criteria. But what I am telling you is the advantage of task-neutral criteria is that the feedback that you give students based on that task-neutral criteria is transferable, which means throughout a semester, if you keep coming back to those competencies, you can keep using parts, if not all of that criteria, and that will transfer that and lead to long-term growth. So says a lot of the research. So the problem is that teachers put in all this effort with feedback, and we don't see the gains. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons we don't see the gains is because every moment of feedback is kind of an isolated event, right? So if we've latched onto a local dilemma, let's say there's a local dilemma in Victoria that we've latched onto, and we want to teach the students about argument and persuasion. And therefore, we're going to write a letter to the editor of the Times Colonist or whatever. We're gonna write a letter to the editor, and that's going to be our first foray into making argument and writing persuasively. Well, the next time we do that, it might not be a letter to the editor. It might actually be a persuasive essay, or it might be a debate where I have to argue something. So in that first letter to the editor, if my feedback is focused on improving the quality of your letter, it might not be transferable to an essay or a debate. But if my feedback is focused on formulating an argument and writing with, or making, an argument and persuasion, then that is transferable to an essay, that is transferable to a debate. And therefore, that's what we would put our feedback focus on, and not the task. So task neutral, competency rich criteria, I think, is one of the keys to really manifesting long-term impact and long-term learning trajectories for our students. So anyway, speech uh, speech/rant over. But that to me those to me are a couple of the keys to really digging into the competencies and seeing the competencies grow over time, because you and the students can get very frustrated if you keep seeing the same mistakes over and over again. And it's possible, and I said the rant was over and here I keep talking, uh, but it's possible that we keep hitting the reset button every time we're providing feedback. That's all. Okay, John, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. That's yeah, fantastic feedback and good ideas moving forward. And that was going to be part of my question for you. Was, here we are at the end of, or almost at the end of June. Getting a little ahead of myself here, and we've done a ton of work. But as we know, summer brain kicks in. So what would you suggest as any strategies for us to keep the momentum going in September, especially if you're, a lot of the folks here, we've been working in school cohorts with a group of people, and perhaps there's people changing schools, changing sites, moving on to different things. How do we keep that momentum going in September? Do you have any tips up your sleeve for us?
Well, I think that the things I just talked about there, I think the thing that would be very helpful would be to do a little bit of auditing of your own practices and take a look at your assessments and ask yourself, some important questions that aren't. They're probably going to be. There's probably going to be a lot of affirmation and reaffirmation of the things that you're doing, but you might occasionally come across something where it's like, oh, maybe I should rethink that. Assessments we have, and again, I don't know every individual that's on the call today, of course, so forgive me if this is something that you've moved past. However, we have for years been conditioned that the size of the assessment is proportional to how serious or rigorous the assessment is. And I think that one of the things that you could really push yourself on is to always keep in the front of your mind quality over quantity. That's an expression I use constantly. High quality assessments is much, there's no rule that says a test has to take the whole class period. We just have been conditioned to say that we called it a test, therefore it has to be stapled. Those are the types of things that are just these narratives that we've created. That formality is another one. How formal an assessment is does not equate to how valid the assessment is. We have to really be expansive. So the first thing I would look at is the quality of my assessments, especially my summative assessments. If you have an end of unit test, if you have an end of unit project or something, project's probably not so much, but the test is probably the biggest culprit. And that's where we have a lot of filler on the tests, right? So we have section A, which is all the multiple choice recall questions. We have section B, it's some of the straightforward, short answer questions. Section C will often be those graphic organizers, climographs, charts, data. And then finally in section D, you actually get to the full extent of the curricular competency. So one of the things that you can do on any sort of end of unit test is first begin by asking yourself, okay, what curricular competencies am I assessing with this assessment? And then the second question is, at what point in this assessment do I actually have the students performing that competency in its totality? Not looking at, I often use the recipe analogy. So I'd say not the individual ingredients, but when are they actually making the meal? When are they actually doing the competency? Sometimes you're going to find it's right off the bat. Sometimes you're going to find it's question 30. And so we've gone 29 questions at the recall level. Now, I know that some people will say to me, well, Tom, I like to have some of those, multiple choice questions or some of those recall questions early on in an assessment as a kind of warm up for the students or a way to kind of build their confidence going into the test. And my response to that is the same. And that is, if you're waiting until test day to build their confidence, it's way too late. I would rather you took all of those multiple choice questions on your unit test and did them 2 weeks ago when you needed information to help you gauge whether or not your students were ready for an uptick in sophistication. Are they ready to move on in the unit? So it's not that you wouldn't use those questions, you would just use them more strategically. And that's the assessment planning alongside the unit planning that I've talked about often. So that part to me. So auditing your assessments is a good place to start, and auditing your rubrics. taking a look at your criteria and saying, okay, what curricular competency am I assessing here? And if I changed the task, could I still use this rubric? And from my perspective, if the answer were no, I would tweak it. I would make sure that the feedback, that the criteria was transferable. So I think there are some granular things that you can do in your units. So first, I would say, take a look at your units and ask yourself, what's my assessment plan alongside my unit plan? That's strategically using assessment along the way to gauge readiness formatively, et cetera. Two, take a look at your summative assessments and ask yourself, again, at what point do I actually get to the curricular competency in its totality? Okay, it's not about having the ingredients on the counter. It's actually about putting them all together and doing what it is the students are expected to do in its completeness. And then three, look at your criteria. These are all things you can do independently. Obviously, you can do them collaboratively, but if you're thinking about, got some time over the summer or early in the fall, you decide you on a weekend, or maybe the families, things have opened up and the family's gone to visit the in-laws, and you've got a weekend to yourself, and you're like, hey, I'll take a look at my assessments because I know that's what you'll do at the free weekend. Said no one ever. But the point is that these are things that you can do on your own. And then collaboratively, we look at the alignment of our instructional practices. We can begin to look at the alignment of our assessments, not so we're all a bunch of robots, but again, we have a provincial curriculum, which means no one really should be a tough or an easy marker. No one really should have assessments that are above or below the level of complexity that's expected. All of those questions can be done collaboratively, but individually, it's that kind of audit that I think would be a good next step for maybe all of you, maybe some of you, maybe most of you. I don't know that.
I really appreciate you your specificity in clarifying the value of content, and also affirming the role that summative assessment still plays in the process too, because I think those two misconceptions, that content doesn't matter and that summative assessment is somehow poor practice, or testing is poor practice, those seem to be some of the most divisive pieces of the assessment conversation in schools. And I've seen entire staff sit with their arms folded across the library from each other, with the test folks on one side and the project-based learning folks on the other side. And it doesn't need to be like that. So I really appreciate you.
John, I am of the mindset, and this has continued to solidify over the years. This assessment journey for me is now finishing its 17th year. This started for me in 03, 04. There's nothing in assessment that should ever be, there's no sentence about assessment that should ever be started with the words always or never. Anytime anybody says to me, oh, we should never use multiple choice, well, that's a ridiculous assertion, because multiple choice is a valid assessment format. Now, secondary teachers, can we be honest here? Sometimes we go to the multiple choice well too much. Okay, so you can't multiple choice everything. Now, before you get offended, when I work with elementary teachers, I tell them, hey, you can't rubric everything either. Okay, so I got to talk to them too. So it's both. Okay, so everything in assessment is context dependent and nuanced. And I worry when people say I only do project-based learning. I'm like, okay, but that is, performance assessment, and not all learning may lend itself to that kind of performance task. So there are some granular assessments. At the same time, we've got to start to move ourselves a little bit away from relying on a very narrow view of what quality evidence has looked like. And I think the pandemic has really helped in many ways. If you can get some of those small silver linings, that what the pandemic has helped is to say that we're going to have to have a more expansive view of what quality evidence looks like. That you just can't send your tests home and then cross your fingers and hope they don't text each other during remote learning, last spring, because they're going to, kids will copy that which is copyable. So you'll have to change that. So I think that we can find our balance, but always and never are not good sentences when it comes to assessment, because everything in assessment is, again, context dependent and nuanced. It is, so it's not about being anti-marks or anti-grades. It's not about being gradeless. It's about accurate and high quality assessment practices that produce the marks. There's nothing wrong with still producing a mark or an overall grade or things like that. But what's more interesting to me is the assessment practices that produce that. And there are some very poor ones that we've employed traditionally that lead to a lot of grade distortion. The averaging of old and new evidence within the same learning, clinging to this percentage-based scale, which I know is required, but there's lots of workarounds for that. The fact that the ministry requires percentage grades a few times a year and that's how kids apply to university, that's just a cop out. Like, that's a crutch. You don't need to provide a percentage-based grade, and there's lots of ways to work around that. When I work with schools, we work on that. If you don't know how to do that, then I understand that part I get. But the idea that we can't do anything because the universities or the community colleges or whatever, that there's workarounds for all of that, and we just have to have the willingness to get comfortable with some of the messiness of those determinations. So the ridiculousness of 101 levels of performance and decimal places, which make it even more absurd. It's counterintuitive. So it does, make me flinch a little bit when people say, Tom, I don't understand this 4-level scale. It's so confusing. I'm like, that's confusing, but somehow 86.4 is clear. Like, I mean, what are we talking about here? One decimal place is 1,000%, 1,000 distinct levels of performance. There isn't anything more inconsistent or unreliable than the percentage scale. So if we have the willingness to kind of work through some of those things, then we can collectively find workarounds for what we have to do. Right. So when we have to submit to the ministry, there are ways to convert things to percentage-based grades that would work fine. And schools have been doing this. So once you have the willingness, there are ways to make, what's that expression? Where there's a will, there's a way. And it's true. There is.
And we held off on talking about the grade conversions until our very last session, because it is one of those roadblocks that sort of impedes the path forward, especially when we're thinking about what are parents going to think, what's post-secondary going to think, and things like that. But as you mentioned, it doesn't need to be this great arduous process. It can be relatively straightforward. When we looked at your video clip of the simple conversion table that you showed and realized, it doesn't have to be this incredibly complicated process. And to that point too, those conversations, especially at secondary, especially at high achieving secondary schools, there's always the parent conversation and the parent concern. And I wanted to just acknowledge one of the parts I really loved about your books is the section around how to talk to parents and how to have those pieces, because I think that's such a valuable information to give teachers, that those conversation points in order to frame this in a way that makes sense for those parent-teacher interview meetings.
Yeah, I think it's important to help keep them. I mean, that's partly the responsibility of the school district, partly responsibility of the school principal, and partly the responsibility of the classroom teacher, is to keep parents informed about things that are changing, especially if you change them mid-year or mid-semester. It just, the idea that you always have to wait to the start of a new school year to change, that means in any given career, you only have 30 opportunities to be different. And that seems a little low. So whenever you're changing something, it's good to keep parents informed and be strategic about it. And that's why I would say that you could do all of this work alone, but you're always going to have a more effective and a more efficient experience if you do it collaboratively, if you do it as a cohort, if you do it together, because then there's going to be some consistent messaging that's coming out of the school, and we can be strategic about that. And the reason we want to be strategic about that is it's not to manipulate parents or to fool them, but it's to make sure there isn't inconsistency, because when there is inconsistency and indecisiveness around the messaging, it can be misinterpreted as that we don't know what we're doing. So we have to be honest about the messiness and the fact that we're learning and we're changing. And I think one of the places you can really help parents is to help them understand that the percentage system is not as precise and accurate as they think it is. And the two ways that I explain it very, very simply is that what has been overwhelmingly clear in the academic literature around the consistency with which teachers use percentage grades. So let's start, for example, the research that's been clear is when you're using a rubric and you're essentially making what's called an indirect scoring inference. So of course, whenever you use a rubric, it's you sitting between the student's demonstration and the criteria. When you look at the student's demonstration, you say that demonstration matches that description, right? So one more point about rubrics, by the way, on a tangent, make sure that your rubrics describe gradations of quality. Okay. Some people will, I'll come back in a moment, but it made me think of one more point about rubrics, because I am recently, and I mean the last couple of years, hearing people saying, "Oh, Tom, I don't like rubrics and I find them too restricting and they don't allow kids creativity and all that." Okay, that happens when your rubrics are poorly designed. Okay, so the rubrics need to describe gradations of quality. This is the expression I use constantly, and I'm going to overemphasize the syllables. Okay, so your rubric should describe gradations of quality, not prescribe output. So look at your rubrics and ask yourself, is this rubric describing quality, or is this rubric telling students what to do? If it's telling them what to do, then change it, because no rubric should be prescriptive. There's no rubric that should stifle anyone's creativity, because what we're saying is, here is the top level of quality. Now, student, your job is to manifest that level of quality in the way that you want. A really simple example. Okay, this is probably oversimplified, but I just use it to make the point. If I told my students that they had to start their story, if I was teaching English language arts and I said, you have to start your story with a flashback, well, that's going to stifle their creativity. That's going to sort of not allow them. So that's prescriptive, right? But if I said to them, you have to, at the beginning of your story, you have to grab your reader's attention. Okay. Have you grabbed your reader's attention right from the opening paragraph? Now, if you want to use a flashback, if you want to use an accident, if you want to use an acute situation, or a chase, or, a dilemma, or that's up to you, right? So the difference is we describe quality, not prescribe output. Okay, now back to the indirect scoring inference. Just very quickly, the margin of error shown between teachers when making an indirect scoring inference and then plotting it on a 0 to 100 scale, the margin of error is consistently somewhere around plus or minus 5 to 6 points. That's a 10 to 12 point window. So what that means to you and I is you could randomly give 3 teachers the same essay, and you could very well expect one to say, well, I think this is a 72. I think this one, another teacher says, I think this is a 78. And another teacher says, I think it's an 84. That's the margin of error. And the research actually says plus or minus 5 to 6 points or more. So when you're using rubrics, making an indirect scoring inference, it's not as precise as you think it is. And why it matters is because reliability or consistency in assessment is really important. Otherwise, if grades are unreliable, if marks are unreliable, they can't be valid. Okay. So if I have 3 English teachers in the same secondary school who have different marking styles and different, marking grids and rubrics, and there's the tough marker, the easy marker, kind of Goldilocks, right? There's the marker that's too hard, the marker that's too soft, and then the marker that's just right. So let's imagine that scenario, but every single student in grade 11 earned a B in English language arts. But you've got a tough marker, an easy marker, and a just right marker. When you look at all those, say 83% they all got an 83, you cannot glean any meaningful information from those marks because there's no consistency in how those marks have been determined. So that makes them unreliable. You lack the reliability. Now here, a little assessment 101. Once you lack a reliable measure, you can't make a valid interpretation of the results. Without reliability, there is no validity. Assessments are not valid or invalid. It's the interpretation that is either valid and invalid, and that only happens when you have a reliable measure. If your marks are inconsistently determined, then whatever you're submitting to the ministry is unreliable and therefore meaningless. You just know that your students need these to apply to university, but that doesn't mean they're meaningful. Okay. Now, some people say then, but Tom, not everything we do is an indirect scoring inference. Sometimes we're just counting right, wrong, yes, no, can, can't. Okay, fair enough. Let's look at that scenario. One student, let's just make it simple. One student writes a quiz, 10 questions, leaves 3 questions blank, scores 7 out of 10, 70%. Another student, same quiz, same class, answers all 10 questions, showed you conceptually that she knew what she was doing, except she made 3 simple mistakes on 3 questions. Also 7 out of 10, also 70%. Those 2 students end up with the same mark. And you and I both know from that very brief description that those 2 learners are not in the same place. Because a percentage score, even if you're dealing with something that's binary, will never account for the type of error that the student has made. Okay, it only accounts for right, wrong. So whether you left it blank and had no clue how to answer the question, or whether you made a simple mistake, there is no accounting for that in a binary system, right, wrong, yes, no, can, can't. So indirect scoring inference, plus or minus 5 to 6 points directly. And those examples directly, it's the type of error. So you could have a student who has the same percentage score, but actually has a deeper understanding of the learning. Where does that get accounted for? That's why the percentage system is so imprecise. So having said all that, those are the types of things that I occasionally talk to parents about, which is helping them understand that this glomming onto a percentage grade and a decimal point, it's not as accurate and as precise as you think it is. So going back, bringing this full circle, going back, John, to that conversion table, that's why that conversion table works, is because it's an imperfect solution to an already imperfect system. Yeah. The plus or minus 5 to 6, some people look and say, well, but Tom, you're just picking a number between those 2 because it doesn't align perfectly. I'm like, yeah, just like the plus or minus 5 to 6 point margin of error that already exists. So it's an imperfect solution to an already imperfect system. And that's the way I would approach it. So helping keep parents in the loop and being a little proactive about explaining why this is not just better, it's more accurate, it's more consistent, you'll get clearer information. It's that type of specific language that I think is most helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting. Tim posted in the chat that he did a session with 35 math teachers, and they all marked the same assessment, and then the range was between 54 to 80% on the same test. So good example. So on that note, I know we've got a lot of folks in the chat that probably have some great questions. So I just would like to open the floor up, and we could do this all sorts of different ways, but you could just unmute yourself and feel free to jump in and ask a question to Tom while we still have him for a couple more minutes here. Feel free to jump in there, folks.
Feels like a radio show. The phone lines are open.
Calling in from Langford tonight, we've got
first time, long time, or long time, first time. Anyone?
Can I just jump in, John?
Absolutely, Scott.
Sure.
Tom, thank you for that. That's very, it's so many great things to unpack, and I'm so glad they're recording this because I want to listen to it all again. I spent a lot of time working with kids in grade 12 for scholarships at universities, and of course it's the numbers game, like you said, and I love that evidence-based, that it's so, we can have a system we can turn, let me rephrase that, we can have that marking system, we can find a way to get a percentage. However, and I think of you, Vic, because we're at 85%, they take English 12 and 3 academic 12s. It's very specific down to 2 decimal places. What's the future of that? Like, how is there has to be a better system that we can reward kids on scholarship and save the grade 12 teachers being ground to a pulp on decimal places.
Yeah, I don't know what the future is on that. I mean, what I do know is that I think it's an unsustainable system, because the sort of, it is a bit of a relic, because our most of our learning goals, once you get past elementary school, and even in upper elementary school or middle school, you know, you're talking about things that are more sophisticated than just counting right and wrong. That's such a sort of fundamental low level. We're talking out of both sides of our mouths right now. We, on the one hand, and I'm talking about the royal we, sort of on the one hand, we're saying we want these 21st century thinkers, we want deep learners, we want kids who are curious, and then everything gets reduced to a system that's about counting. and this sort of binary approach to assessment. Something has to give. It's all doable because we all know that UVic, UBC, SFU, all the major universities, and even some of the less than major universities accept students from out of country.
Right.
Not every student, receives a percentage-based grade. I work with a lot of international schools, and a lot of them are, employing the IB program that grades on 7 levels.
Right.
One would have to wonder how any of those kids get into our BC universities. Somehow they do. France, I think, has 20 levels. AP, in the United States has 5 levels. So there comes a point where, we even have elements of it right now with the 6-point scale. I don't know why we haven't taken advantage of that and blown that out. And use that 6-point scale for most, if not all, subjects. I think the future of it is eventually this is all going to come from the ministry, because the universities are not going to. It's both a funding issue, but it's also a political issue. So when the Ministry of Education, if they were to come out and say, okay, that's it with percentage-based grades, we're using our 4-level scale, and that's how we're reporting student learning. I want you to just imagine the scenario that says, well, UBC president steps in front of the microphone and says, well, in that case, we're not taking any students from the province of British Columbia because you're not giving us percentage-based grades. That's, the Ministry of Education supplements the funding for BC students that go to public universities. So we may not, the ministry doesn't necessarily dictate everything about the university, but they do help a lot, and they have sway over the universities. And I think that would all be done in conjunction. So I hope the future is a move away from this. I just think it's getting ridiculous that we are continuing to cling to this as our curriculum is becoming more sophisticated, and we're just clinging to this system of decimal places. And I think there's a better way to do scholarships. Yes. I'll give you a very quick example. I was in Michigan probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, Ann Arbor, Michigan. And at the break of my workshop, a woman came up to me and she said, my son just applied for a scholarship we were talking about a little bit about this. And she said, my son just applied for a scholarship at Michigan State. I want to tell you about the whole process. And I said, okay, tell me. And I'll give you a very quick version of it. What she said is they brought all the scholarship candidates into the school on campus. Of course, COVID might make this difficult, but down the road, they grouped them into groups of 6 at a table. They put a problem in the middle of the table, and they said, each of your groups, you have 3 hours to solve that problem. Get out your laptops, get out your iPads, solve the problem. And the adjudicators just sat around, like they stood around the room, they rotated around the room, and they just watched. And that's how they decided the scholarships. I thought it was brilliant. I thought, what a really progressive, kind of amazing process. I thought that was, there's a lot of detail to that, but I thought at least they're thinking about different ways to award scholarships and all of that. But percentages can be produced if you need to for those purposes. It's just, I would try to steer away from using percentages on every assignment. That's all. But I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic that we will at one point move away from that in our entire system. I'd rather go back to letter grades, honestly. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
There's a question in the chat from Graham. Interesting one. You talked a little bit about the emerging data on feedback, but what are some other new areas that you're exploring, Tom? And does it include Indigenous principles of assessment?
That's that's a good question. One of the things I'm exploring right now is, and I mentioned this in the past, and I'm digging a lot deeper into this right now, is for example, the expansive use of storytelling as an assessment method. That's one example. And storytelling, again, is not, when we think of storytelling, we think of Indigenous communities, but it's not exclusive to Indigenous communities. Storytelling is a big part of the legacy of West African tribes, for example. Storytelling, every culture has a history of storytelling, because, prior to literacy, everything was oral and everything was about story and the way we tell stories. So I think there's a lot to be gained from exploring the notion of say different story formats, not just the singular sort of conflict, the hero's journey kind of storytelling, but I think there's a lot of different story formats where students can sort of tell the story of their learning. So for example, you could take a history 12 class or a history social studies class and ask them, yes, we've looked at all of these different conflicts, but what's the story of revolution? Like, tell me the story of revolution. What is that? Like, we've seen all of these revolutions happen throughout history. Where do they come from? What do they have in common? What's the story of that? Right. So there's a way to incorporate, it's not just an English language arts format, right? The story behind scientific discoveries, which often happen by accident. So what's the story behind that, right? Those are things. And I can also tell the story of my learning. So I can tell my story, my journey as a learner in a more narrative way. So that's something I'm kind of very interested in digging into. And I think, of course, here in Canada, when it comes to something like storytelling, I think we connect it very deeply to Indigenous culture, and rightly so. But I also think that when in the times where I've been able to stop and take a broader look, you start to realize that storytelling is actually what unites humanity. Like, storytelling is ubiquitous. As you start digging and going down that rabbit hole, you start to realize that storytelling is a tradition of every culture, and that's actually something that could really bring us together in a way. So
I think back to even my days as a student, the teachers I remember the most were the ones that told the best stories, and those are the pieces you remember.
Yeah, for sure.
Another question in the chat from our old friend Alexis. Hey, Alexis, and thoughts on
Alexis.
the single point rubric?
Yeah, Alexis, good to see you again. Been a long time since the airport in Seattle.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
Yeah, single point rubrics. I have the same perspective of single point rubrics that I do of assessment methods. Okay, every rubric format is valid and has advantages, but every rubric format has potentially limitations. So what I like about the single point rubric from a practical perspective is they are much easier to construct. Okay, they're easier to build because you're really talking about just one sort of ideal set of criteria. And for me, now I know there's some debate out there about this, but for me, on a single point rubric, I would put my extending, my 4, if you will, down the center, because again, I'm focused on the sophisticated quality. I'm not looking for a more granular extension beyond the standard or the learning. And we could talk more about that in a moment. But and then you've got on the one side, typically the left side, it's aspects that need strengthening, and on the right hand side, you've got areas that are strong and specifics. So upside, easy to construct. Another upside, it allows you to personalize feedback. So feedback using analytic rubrics with all the boxes can be very efficient, but it can also be kind of generic. So I love that about the single point rubrics. What you have to go in eyes wide open with single point rubrics is they are more labor intensive. They are going to take you longer. And for me, anybody who denies that isn't using them right, because they are. The idea of highlighting an analytic rubric versus being descriptive about next steps and what's strong, to me, but that's okay. Like, I'm not saying that's just something you have to be prepared for if you're using single point rubrics. And a teacher might say, the upside to personalizing feedback is worth the effort, therefore I'm using them. So this is really analyzing each type of rubric in a neutral way. You just have to be honest about they're more labor intensive. And I don't love them for summative assessment, because I think if a student is less than the criteria you've identified, then it's a little less clear as to why they are not that level. So I tend to favor, I like the idea of starting with the analytic rubric, because I think once you have that, you can build from there. I like the idea of using what I really love, by the way, about the single point rubric is for self-assessment and peer assessment. Now you distribute the workload, and they're great observation tools as well. So if you were having your students in a discussion group, you could walk around, listen to those conversations, and make notes to yourself about what some students have said or how they're even collaborating, right? Really great tools for that. And I tend to be one who would say, teach with analytic rubrics and single point rubrics, but mark holistically. Mark in the spirit of the 6-point scale that we use for writing. Like, to me, marking holistically and making a holistic judgment is much more favorable because it is more reliable. The reason we've been using that 6-point scale provincially for years, if not decades now, is because it's more consistent. It's how you build reliability. It's how you build what's called inter-rater reliability. If you had to use all the moving parts of an analytic rubric, it would take twice, if not 4 times as long to mark provincial essays. So to me, there's real advantage to every tool, but I think they're great tools as long as you go into them eyes wide open, knowing that they are more labor intensive, but you may be able to replace quantity with quality. And that quality feedback may be more advantageous to advanced learning.
Great point. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tim's got a question up next.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Tom. I'm a math teacher, math 12 and calculus 12. And so my question is about the math is traditionally very content dense. There's very clear content that we look at, and there's also very clear curricular competencies that we're also flexing through almost all of the content. So when we're trying to put together sort of a system to keep track of where students are and what their next steps are, how can one keep the content sort of as separate tasks that they separate outcomes in themselves, and then the curricular competencies also separate, and so that in one document you could track them sort of independently, in the sense that, you know, the competencies are, we cycle through them again and again and again through all the content, versus trying to do something like take the curricular competency with the content in one learning standard, or something else. So that's what my mind is kind of trying to make sense of, and I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think in some respects you could do that. The complexity comes that in order to demonstrate the curricular competency, you need the content. You have to think about something. So the content, for me, the building of that foundation is early in the learning. So if I start a unit, if you think of the taxonomy, we might think about building the foundation of knowledge, and then you start to move yourself through, Bloom's taxonomy, the revised taxonomy, all the different taxonomies out there are really about cognitive rigor. That's why I was saying earlier that the problem with the content as it's outlined on the framework, you wouldn't know how to assess them. The only decisions you're making right now are based on what you used to do. Because if I were a brand new teacher and I was given the framework and I had no one to talk to, but I had all of my assessment knowledge, I wouldn't know how to assess the content, because the content has no cognitive rigor associated with it. It isn't until you pair it with the curricular competencies that suddenly the rigor emerges. So in my learning progression, my unit plan, what I would want to do is begin by maybe using some pre-assessment to gauge levels of readiness, to create multiple points of entry into the learning, so we are most inclusive and expansive in where we begin. But once we start, we build that solid foundation, and we use assessment to say, okay, have they got all of the fundamentals? Okay, let's move to the next level now. Not as clinically as I'm describing, but in a way that sort of progresses from simple to sophisticated. Now, when it comes to the end of unit assessment, that to me is where I'd want them to put it all together. I would want them to use the content for some purpose, some deeper learning. So you could track separately acquisition of content, if you will, to gauge levels of readiness to go deeper with the learning. But I wouldn't personally want my content acquisition to now be able to offset my curricular competency results, because that to me seems like not what the ultimate learning goals are. And therefore I'm allowed to leverage, early understandings or definitions with my inability to meet the curricular competency. That's the opposite of rigor. That to me is that is making things easier in a way. And that's, we're not in the business of making things harder or easier, but to me, that's kind of the opposite of what we're trying to do. So to me, it's what's really important is that once I identify the curricular competencies of the unit, then that's what we put our focus on for that culminating activity. And what's built into, or again, sometimes they use the recipe analogy and the baking analogy that really works. So forgive me, but what's baked into the question are some of the ingredients, right? So if I ask you to make me a cake and you don't use enough flour, I don't have to assess flour separately. I will taste it in your cake that you didn't use enough flour, or I'll see that you didn't use any baking powder. I'll taste the lack of sugar. I'll taste it. It's there. It's built into the question. The math example, this is very simple compared to what you teach, but I don't need to assess a student separately on their ability to calculate squares and square roots on a test. All I need to ask you to do is find the third side of a right triangle using the Pythagorean formula, because built into the question of Pythagoras is whether or not you can calculate squares and square roots. I'll see it. So I don't need to have a separate section that says, what's the square root of 49? What's 8 squared? Because here's a dilemma. What if the student makes simple mistakes on that section A with all the squares and square roots, but then answers every question in section B, finding the third side of a right triangle, answers them flawlessly? Now what?
There's no dilemma unless you don't take the latter information.
That's right. So to me, those
Tom,
square and square root, but let me finish the thought. For me, those square and square root questions are critical, but they would have been more critical 2 weeks ago to gauge readiness. That's where I do it. Okay, follow up.
Yeah, thanks for that. So what I've tried this quarter is a digital portfolio where every day we look at which curricular competencies make sense to be pursuing, to be flexing, to be reporting on, reporting on, for lack of better words, by the student themselves. And they're regularly updating their portfolio, showing me and themselves how they are growing within the competencies. And I've left it I've given them a lot of I've been quite flexible and given them a lot of latitude with what they are placing in there, because they could take any unit that the competency has been flexed, and they're sharing out on that. But it does feel, as a math teacher, I'm used to it being very cut and dry, and what I'm doing does not feel like that at all. It's very free. I don't know how free flowing it is. I feel like I need some eyes on this thing. So
well, but that's for them, right? I mean, that's part of the picture of their self-assessment in their growth and competencies. You're not using any of that for their marks or anything like that, are you? Or are you?
I would, for sure, because I'm seeing what they're showing me what they can do in a variety of ways.
But who's determining the degree to which they've demonstrated the competency?
We both together.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of thinking about the self-assessment piece on the core competencies, but you have to still be the final arbiter of inaccurate self-assessment is not helpful. It's counterproductive. So there's the worse than having students self-assess is have them self-assess inaccurately. And usually what you find, at least large scale in terms of the research, is that the more proficient a student is, the more accurate their self-assessments will be. The less proficient they are, the less proficient they are, the more amazing they think they are. That's kind of how it works. There's exceptions to that, but age is also a factor. So the older the students are, they tend to be more accurate. So as long as it's done in conjunction, if it's, I think you're more comfortable. My guess would be that you would be more comfortable with the messiness than you're making out to be, because if I were to tomorrow walk into your classroom and I were to say to you, all right, let's turn off all technology. We wouldn't do this because this would embarrass the students, but just hypothetically, let's say we did this. I said to you, okay, here's what I want you to do. In that far corner, I want you to put all of the students who you know, or at least believe, overall, we're talking overall here, I want you to put in that corner all of the students that you believe have a deep, sophisticated understanding of most of the curricular competencies or the learning goals of the class. Now, in that corner, I want you to put all the students that you think are proficient, or, so the far corner extending proficient. These are students who have a complete understanding, they're competent, but it's not deep and sophisticated. Now, behind me, I want you to put the students who are partway there. They've got some parts of it, but they don't, there's other things they need to work on. And then over here in this corner, we're going to put all the students who overall are still very much at the beginning stages of understanding what calculus is all about. Now, in the center, again, we wouldn't do this, but in the center, we're going to put all the students who've given you insufficient evidence to make that determination. Now, my guess is if I showed up to your classroom tomorrow, you could finish that task in 10 minutes or less without a computer and without any calculation. And you would be right. Maybe one student's on the fence, but you know. And that's the judgment part. What I just did there is an example of summative assessment. Sometimes people get so locked into the summatives, as in they're an event, that what we sometimes fail to recognize is that summative actually is just a moment in time where a teacher examines the preponderance of evidence and says, what is the degree to which the student understands the learning goals of this class? And what I just went through there with those four corners is exactly what you would do on a provincial scale. I'd say, turn off your computer. Now tell me the students in your class who have a deep, sophisticated, authentic understanding of pre-calculus. You'd be able to list those for me, no problem. Maybe not in September, but by October, you'd definitely be able to tell me, right? So I really think that's an important piece, is to embrace, it's messy, yes, because we're used to counting, but it's your professional judgment, which is based on your experience and your expertise. And imagine if we all come together and talk about what excellence looks like. Now we'll have confidence in that judgment and be able to defend that judgment on the established criteria. So it does feel messy at first. And so I'm empathetic to how that can feel at first, a little uncomfortable. But if you're doing it with the students and you are the final arbiter and you're asking them to demonstrate evidence. So once the student says, here's where I think I am, make sure, I'm sure you do this already, make sure you ask them a follow-up question, which is, not cynically like prove it, but more optimistically is say, okay, what led you to that conclusion? What you're asking for is for them to substantiate their claim so that they do have to prove that their assertions are accurate, especially if it's going to be part of their mark, because there is a lot of incentive to maybe be a little fuzzy with the truth when something is at stake. That's why you have to be the final gatekeeper. And if the student is off one way or the other, because a lot of students will either overrate or underrate themselves, that's the conversation starter. That's the perfect opportunity to say, okay, well, now here's what I've seen when I look at this and I look at the criteria. So go back into the criteria, think about that. Well, okay, I get where you're coming from. Or you might say to a student, you have really undersold yourself here, because when I look at the criteria and I look at these demonstrations in the portfolio, you're way further along the continuum than you're giving yourself credit for. And that's also a teachable moment for students. So it's a really good a conversation starter for sure.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Tom. And I realize we're a little bit over time. Do you have time for one last quick question, Tom? Before
I got lots of time. I'm in no hurry to go, so I'm good.
Thank you, Tom. Scott, one last question to you before we wrap up.
Thanks, Tom. And I just want to pick up what you were talking about of the 6-point scale that, yes, I've known to use for a long time, and it was very, very, very clear for social studies. So social studies 11, history 12, I'm thinking of history 12. How would you adapt the 6-point scale into the curricular competencies? And in light of that, what I did was take the idea of emerging, developing, extending, saying if you're at an extending has to be a 6. And then here's the 4 criteria we're looking, and we're using that language kind of makes it doubling it up. Is there another way you're doing that? Are you advocating for keeping that 6-point scale? I'm just a little unclear on what you said.
No, I would do it that way. And if you wanted to use the 6-point scale, I would just use the 6, 5, 4, 3, and that's it. And if on a 6-point scale there are 2 or a 1, give it back to them and say it's not ready. Fix it. It's not good enough. Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I would just build it. When I work with schools overseas, IB schools, they say, well, we want to incorporate the rubric, and I'll say to them, well, how often do you use the 1 or the 2 on your 7-point scale? They say almost never. I say, okay, well, let's build a 5-point rubric and build it from 7 to 3. And if they give you a 1 or a 2, just hand it back to them and say, this is not good enough. Like, part of our job is to stop marking crappy work. I don't mean that to be disrespectful, but give it back to them and say, it's not ready. Let's fix this. Like, let's get you to a level of excellence. Let's stop letting them settle for, oh, well, I'm developing, so I'll just take it. No, that's not the spirit of what we're after. Now, of course, there's individual students for whom that might be a scratch and claw way to get them there. I get that. But so in all seriousness, what I mean is just keep focusing on those top 4 levels. I would make, the 6 my extending, the 5 my proficient, the 4 the developing, and the 3 I'd build my criteria that way.
Yeah,
and then the 1 or the 2 would be insufficient. It's just not, it's non-existent. It's time to just fix it, and then I'll mark it.
We call it the must-haves. You can't get to that point unless you have these must-haves.
Yeah, that's right.
That's great.
Because
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Tom, I can't thank you enough for your time this afternoon. And everybody, truly, this series has been such a pleasure. It's been the highlight of my spring, and I hope you've had an enjoyable experience, and I hope you can take the momentum and the learning that you've done this year and keep it rolling next year, and like a stone rolling down that hill, just gather speed. Thank you for watching or listening to the show. You can find all of our episodes, leave us a voice message, or send us any questions or comments at our website, shift-ed.ca. Until next time, take care.